Hello, welcome back to Aaron Ducker versus the Monsters. It is I, Aaron Ducker, the real Grinch who stole Christmas. And yes, I'm selling out and doing a Christmas special, but don't worry. Don't worry, I'm not going to debunk Christmas. Bill O'Reilly can sleep in peace. I'm not waging war on Christmas. I can't even debunk Santa Claus. Because pale white-haired philanthropists who dress in red and like to empty their sacks around children have since been proven.
Slasher films are considered one notch above pornography in a lot of people's minds. I've been told at least a half a dozen times in my career that the horror genre is dead, and that's usually about 6 months from the time that I get a really good idea or somebody else does.
Now today we're going to explore the origins of horror.
Horror has been around forever.
Certainly, you go back like 5,000 years with the Odyssey, and it's full of monsters, as I call it.
The ancient Romans, the thrill of watching people torn apart by animals. They would gather in mass to see something like that. What was that fulfilling? What was that catering to?
Now, if we're going to go back to the roots of horror, we have to go back to Medea. Because to me, Medea is where horror starts. The ancient Greek play of Medea is basically a theatre of Thea. To the Greeks, Medea is the most horrifying thing ever. In Greek society, women were meant to be bearers of children. That's their whole purpose in life, to bear children. Medea kills her children, so she is a complete abomination against nature. She is going against everything she's meant to be.
I knew it before I saw it, I knew. No wild beast would have done it.
I have done it because I loathed you more than I loved them.
I should have killed you the day I saw you.
I tore my own heart and laughed. I was tearing yours.
Will you laugh while I
I
strangle
would still
you?
laugh. I would still be joyful to know that every bone of your life is broken.
Now this all really comes into its own when you realise that all theatre in Greek times was performed in Athens. And at the end of the play, Medea takes off to go to Athens. So it's basically the killer, the horror of the film, of the play, is coming directly to where the play is being performed. So it's basically saying this is the most evil person in the world and she's coming to a town near you.
When will you come to Athens?
To Athens? Why, if I come, if I live, it will be soon.
One of the biggest influences on horror in its infancy is the Surrealism and Expressionism movements. Such artists as Francesco Goya and Edvard Munch are hugely influential within the advent of horror cinema. Expressionism at its core is about trying to tap into the subconscious and realize our subconscious fears. Another line in the lineage towards horror films is fairy tales.
The lone killer of the Hollywood slasher movie has his roots way back in the traditions of European folklore, in the universal myth of the avenging monster out there somewhere in the woods, and in the dark imaginings of fairy tales and children's cautionary rhymes.
Well, the easiest genre in the world to criticize is the horror genre. And if you want to be even more specific, the slasher genre, because to a critic, what is the value? Well, what's valuable about it is that it allows people to experience their humanity.
The thing with horror movies, when you look at them closely, you see that what they are essentially is fairy tales. It's a kind of fairy tale that folklorists call the Bloody Chamber, stories about places that you're warned not to enter.
It's the interest of looking into the dark room. It's that door that you don't want to open, that most people don't open.
If you look at such fairy tales as Little Red Riding Hood, which is really, really tying into horror, That is a plot about a girl going to her grandmother's house, but she doesn't go straight to her grandmother's house. She goes into the woods. She leaves the path. The path is safe, but she goes into the darkness of the woods and she meets the wolf. Now, one of the most important things to happen in the late 1800s was the advent of the Grand Guignol Theatre.
Grand Guignol is a term which has entered our language to describe the most gruesome events. But was there anything quite so harrowing as the events enacted on a small stage in Paris almost 100 years ago?
What else could possibly be so harrowing, Clive Barker?
In the spring of 1897, man's taste for the macabre found a new level of splendor with the Paris opening of the Theatre du Grand Guignol. And for the next 60 years, the original theater of horror brought scenes of rape, torture, and grotesque violent stunts to a voyeuristic live audience.
This is a form of theatre which revels in nasty things happening to people. And they were little horror movies in themselves.
Thousands and thousands of plays, were written and were very popular. Just eye gouging and, faces in fire and burning at the stake and arrows through the, there was something about wanting to see that happen to people.
The gouging out of eyes, you have blood being splayed around, really graphic theatre.
And people would shriek out loud, they would faint.
They would have terrible wounds, you would see blood.
There was an alleyway down the side of the theatre in Paris where people could be witness hyperventilating.
Now, the start of horror films really comes out of the European Gothic novel and stuff like the works of Edgar Allan Poe, Victorian literature, which was basically about man versus science and nature versus science, or the fear inherent in those times of man versus technology.
It's really important that we understand that these monsters are actually very attractive to us. Also a part of us that actually wants to be these monsters. These monsters are very powerful figures. They're things, they're creatures who have powers that maybe we want. I would love to be able to fly. I'd love to be able to turn into a wolf and live forever. Those are wonderful attributes.
When horror was born in film, it was your basic monster movie stuff. But the first horror movie ever made, known as The Haunted Castle or House of the Devil, was a vampire movie. Although if you want to go further back, the first technical slasher film was a film called The Execution of Mary Stuart, which was a film designed exclusively to shock audiences, although masquerading under a film of historical importance, which is a reenactment of Mary Queen of Scots decapitation, which looks like this. That was the film. It's 12 seconds long, and it's just the first decapitation on film. So to me, that's technically the first horror film, although the first one with a proper script and proper story was, of course, The Haunted Castle. Really shaped the genre. One of the most perfect horror movies ever made was Psycho.
If you think of, let's say, the great horror movies of American cinema up to the time of Psycho, really, all the monsters were, came from somewhere else. They were either these Europeanized monsters like Frankenstein or the Wolfman or Dracula, or they came from ancient Egypt like the Mummy, or they were alien creatures.
No longer could we rely on horror being
Psycho was the point at which the guy who looked eminently normal, handsome, desirable even, could stab you with a big knife for no reason that you were capable of perceiving.
You had Ed Gein, who had murdered a lot of people.
I had no idea that Bloch had written his book about a real person. I read it and I thought, this is a strange thing for Hitchcock to do. He just sat there like this, with his hands on his belly, and never moved, never blinked. Never said a word. When I got to the point where she gets killed while she's in the shower, he said, "We could get a star."
The genius of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho whet the appetite of the American audiences.
No longer could we hide behind horror being fantasy. Horror was now real. Horror was us.
I would consider it the granddaddy of the slasher film, the film that inspired all the slasher films to come. You know, Halloween, Friday the 13th, all these movies really owe a debt to Psycho.
The slasher movie came along because if Psycho had 2 of these scenes, think what we'll do at the box office if it has 3. And then the next time you say 4, and then pretty soon you got 8 kids in a summer camp and they're all getting killed.
The next phase in horror movies from Psycho was Halloween. Halloween decided to up the murder.
Crucial central performance is Jamie Lee Curtis's performance. It's brilliant. She looks like a human being. She creates a true character that the audience very strongly identifies with.
Deborah thought it'd be a great idea to cast her, plus the fact that she was Janet Leigh's daughter, which kind of connected back to Psycho.
Horror movies before that, the metaphors had gotten old. If you take, for example, the Wolfman sort of the metaphor, that's about fear of one's own bestiality, or the 50s science fiction movies, which were about the fear of science and how that could get out of control. I think in the 80s there was a new perception that the enemy was ourselves, that the worst possible enemy was another human who had gone crazy and whose motive was not rational, who could just come out of the blue and kill you.
Now I'd like to take this moment to thank the sponsors of Aaron Ducker vs. the Monsters. I'd like to, but I fucking can't because there aren't any. Now you know why they show so low quality. After Halloween came out, there was a bunch of low-rent knockoff slasher films which pretty much tried to imitate Halloween's success to varying degrees of success. Arguably one of the biggest films to come out of the post-Halloween craze is Friday the 13th. But its real popularity lies in not that it was a great film, because it's not. Its real popularity lies in the fact that it wasn't just sent out to grungy, dirty little theatres down Rape Alley. It was actually put in proper mainstream theatres so you could sit down and have nice company and on nice, soft, cushiony seats. And you could enjoy the luxuries that other cinema goers got to do while watching a horror film.
Friday the 13th was absolutely a phenomenon. Nobody could have predicted the kind of money that it made, and nobody could have predicted the kind of respectability that it achieved, although it was certainly not a respectable film on any level.
And suddenly, Paramount and Warner Brothers start bidding against each other. We decide that we're going to go with Frank Mancuso, who was head of distribution at Paramount at the time. And what he wanted to do was something completely different. He wanted to open it nationally.
You had a major studio behind a low-rent slasher film for the first time. You would never think a studio would pick up a film like that. That was a pure exploitation, pure sleaze in a lot of ways that, you know, a film that was usually relegated to the grindhouses in 42nd Street.
But Friday the 13th infiltrated mainstream theaters all over America.
He was a major studio, picked up the film for nothing, and gave it this major release.
Sean Cunningham was a filmmaker with very minor credits. I mean, Last House on the Left was certainly a movie that people who frequented underground kind of movies knew. And I don't mean underground like art movies. I mean underground like sleazy movies, creepy movies. The things that you would see at the drive-in or at the diviest, nastiest theater in your town or city.
Of course, the biggest reinvention in horror would be Nightmare on Elm Street.
There was a case when I was a kid of hearing shuffling footsteps when I was in bed outside our apartment and getting up and looking out, and there was an old man dressed more or less like Freddy Krueger, you know, the sort of hat.
He looked up and caught young Wes's eye in the window, and Wes shut the curtains. Went back to bed and pulled the covers over his head. Couldn't sleep and got up a little while and went and opened the curtains again, and the man was still down there looking up at the window.
I remember that sense of not only being terrified by what was kind of like a father figure, but might have been a drunk, might have been a vagrant, but you know, just somehow somebody that was clearly getting off on frightening a kid, you know, and even making a threat gesture.
The genius of Nightmare on Elm Street is it went back to its pure surrealist, expressionist roots. This was no longer just gore or slasher violence. This was proper surrealism, proper surrealist cinema.
With some slasher films, I think it's just blood and guts and torture and things like that, which are pretty reliably upsetting, but I think kind of a cheat, you know. To me, it's much more about the social, economic, psychological zeitgeist of what's going on in the culture at the time that I try to get at.
In doing so, it reinvented horror. It created plastic reality films such as Hellraiser and Candyman and Jacob's Ladder. A whole new type of horror was about to be born out of that.
Why does that Freddy Krueger, why does he have to have such long fingernails?
Well, because he's not nervous at all, he never bites his nails.
Just as real-life neighbourhood necrophiles like Ed Gein were made more manageable by being turned into mythical celebrities, so the slasher movie villains they inspired enjoyed a similar transformation through sanitising sequels. Laurie Strode may have been the heroine of Halloween, but Michael Myers is the hero of Halloween 4. Jason Voorhees is barely glimpsed in Friday the 13th, but he comes centre stage in films like Jason Takes Manhattan, Jason Goes to Hell, and the long-promised Freddy vs. Jason. In time-honoured tradition, the murderous maniacs became movie stars, and the more popular they got, the less frightening they were. And slowly, the slasher movie lost its reason to live.
There is a problem when you take a horror film character, or any character, or set of characters, and then franchise them and start doing sequels. And the problem is, you then separate the characters from the plot.
TV show, games, t-shirts, masks. The horror icons are being mass-marketed to middle America. Horror films never really had been merchandised before, and then when New Line found out there was money to be made in merchandising, you know, they found every way they could exploit it, and they did.
The more you franchise something and merchandise it, the less scary it can be because the more familiar it is. At one point, the Nightmare on Elm Street camp had the idea of doing Freddy Krueger pajamas for little kids.
Freddy was becoming seen as almost like a dark comedian, that he was being merchandised. There were dolls. They made him less and less threatening, I think, and more.
That's all we have time for this year. I'll see you in 2014. If the world doesn't end, which hopefully it fucking does. Goodbye.
You're a movie.
Quite.
You're a movie.
Yes.
The exception.
That's right.
You're the one of kind. You're a movie.
More of an epic.
Please include me. Send us to the line.
That's right. Very good.
The bullets repel off my metals, and my men are in awe when I speak. All chaos my strategy settles.